How did the world react to Germany's Anschluss of Austria? This is by History Now. Now, I know specifically how one country reacted. Meanwhile, the rest of the world kind of just, I don't want to say let it happen, but at the same time, they kind of did. I mean, don't get me wrong, they didn't like it for sure. So, obviously the British...
The French were alarmed by it.
Yes, alarmed, that's a good way to put it.
Threatened the balance of
power
course. In Europe.
But did they do anything about it? I mean, not really. What could they do? I mean, this happened in March 1938. The Allied powers really didn't want to have to fight another world war. Obviously, they would have to at some point. So, you know, they were just kind of like nervously sweating while they watched that in the corner.
In Europe. But neither really wanted to do anything to escalate the situation and potentially cause a war. The Russians were also pissed.
I mean, even when they would go after Czechoslovakia, the Allied powers were like, are you sure you want to do that? We should try some appeasement. They weren't even on that train yet with Austria.
For the same reason, but couldn't really do anything to stop it, and no one else cared enough to help them. Italy, although a German ally, wasn't exactly stoked about the annexation since they wanted the land, but thought it was more important to keep Germany friendly, and so they did nothing.
That's interesting. Finally, that's interesting perspective. This is the country I know about. Mexico was the only place to actually protest it.
The most furious as it launched a formal complaint in the League of Nations and refused to recognize the annexation, but nobody really took them seriously.
Mexico's actually a fascinating country in terms of diplomacy. They've actually played it pretty smart over the decades. They normally do a really great job of not picking a side or not pissing off a certain country, but in this case, they thought it'd be best if they were like, yo, Germany, that wasn't cool. And that is why still to this day, you can visit Vienna, Austria, and see this plaque dedicated to Mexico here. Forgot to mention the USA didn't really care and their response was basically non-existent. I love how Mexico went absolute ape poop over Austria being annexed, even though they had nothing to do with them. Everyone else, yeah, I'm angry, but I won't do poop. Meanwhile, Mexico, so you've chosen death. I'm sure there were certain countries in the region that were very alarmed, but again, they didn't do anything. How did Europe react to the American Civil War? Also another video by History Now. I often ask myself this question because this very much could have changed the outcome. I mean, can we even begin to imagine if the British or the French decided to aid the South in the Civil War? I think ultimately why they decided against it will be a factor that a lot of people can probably see. 1861 to 1865.
By the war since their supply of southern cotton was cut off by the Union blockade. However, they never joined the conflict since they needed the Union.
And for that reason, it's like, I feel like it's plausible to see them possibly have interfered. Also, keep in mind, like, wanting to still get revenge on us, the USA, their former colony. That would have been a great way to slap us in the face.
Wheat supply. The French were also pissed about the cotton and even invaded Mexico.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so they were a little distracted. They decided to invade Mexico while the US was finally distracted. The US obviously had the Monroe Doctrine. They didn't want European powers to interfere in the American continents, but we couldn't do anything at this time.
Alongside Austria to take advantage of a distracted USA.
Yeah, they were going to install a monarch there.
There was little to gain. Prussia and Russia were both pro-Union.
So it probably wouldn't have been any, I mean, plus in order to like, remember that the US had the South completely blockaded. But something the British could have very easily done is broken that up if they wanted. The British Navy could have definitely blown up some American ships and freed the South. And who knows, maybe just aiding with some resources, maybe even British boots on the ground fighting for the southern states. That's insane. I mean, remember, our existence is basically due to France. And the only reason the French helped the 13 colonies get their independence is they just wanted revenge on the British. So who's to say the British wouldn't just want revenge on the USA by helping this little like raised tumor come out of us?
Since there was little to gain. Prussia and Russia were both pro-Union and wanted to keep the USA friendly since they would be a useful counterweight to Britain.
A lot of countries were just pro-Union.
Finally, the Ottomans were very happy with the war since they could sell way more cotton with the Confederacy being blockaded and make way more money. And so they were very pro-Union.
Oh. I thought we were going to get into the British. The vast majority of the time, I see that the British didn't interfere because they were also not pro-slavery. They outlawed it almost 3 decades before the American Civil War, so they thought that was, like, stupid. It's probably a more elegant way for me to have put that, but yeah. There's more factors than just that, but that's often the thing that I see cited. USA going through a civil war, meanwhile France and Austria had time to invade Mexico. What a weird side quest. USA and Russia giving each other a high five is absolutely surreal. The English were heavily leaning towards the South until the Emancipation Proclamation. Since they had outlawed slavery decades previous, they could not very well suddenly show support for slavers. I always see this answer. I gotta say, this feels like a really 2024 response to world history. This is the British Empire we're talking about. If it ultimately aided the British Empire, I don't think they would have given a fuck. I mean, historically speaking, they were pretty cutthroat. If there was a major benefit the British were gonna get out of the South winning, you know, they probably would have done it. That's why I don't like whenever I see those answers. How did everyone else react back to the American Independence War. Now, this is a good question, especially considering Spain at that time. And when we talked about the French, the Spanish also did aid us, and they did not like the British Empire, obviously. But just look at how massive that Spanish colonial empire was at that time. You had to think, like, in the back of their head, is this a bad idea? Could we be instilling values in our own colonial holdings that they should also fight for their own independence? I wonder. Because eventually they would, and they ended up all getting their freedom. The French did not care. They just, like I talked about, wanted their revenge.
The French openly supported the American cause and would eventually join the war against the British, playing a crucial role during the fighting.
Absolutely. That's the only reason, I mean, I'm going to say it's the only reason why we won. And it's funny because the French literally kamikazed their own nation to beat the British. Considering like only a couple years after that, the French Revolution began, and like I said, they blew up their own nation. They honestly just did not care as long as those British took an L. So yeah, they did a good,
the fighting.
Pretty crucial role.
The Spanish would also do the same, but were less enthusiastic about U.S. independence due to it potentially sparking independence.
There it is. There it is. Now they did participate, they did help us, but to a lesser role.
And so they were just in it to screw over the British for now. Russia, Prussia, and Austria were neutral,
but all those independences didn't come till like 40 years later, so ultimately they got to keep their colonial holdings for another 4 decades.
Supportive of American efforts to check British power.
Oh yeah, of
However,
course.
They were concerned about the anti-monarchy ideas of Americans spreading to their countries, and so they never supplied aid to either side. Finally, the Dutch sold weapons and munitions to the U.S., but were divided on who to favor, and so there was no desire for the Dutch to further anger the European superpower next door.
I actually haven't looked into that.
They decided to stay out of it.
That kind of makes sense. I mean, ultimately, the world was just really trying to get a dub over the British. Like, after the 7 Years' War, which took place like 2 or 3 decades before American independence, the UK was clearly the #1 nation. Like, they just were the world superpower, period. So everyone wanted to see them get brought down a notch or two. Maybe not the Portuguese, they were always cool with the British, but technically speaking, belligerents that took place are just the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch Republic against the Great British Empire. This is random, but I'm wondering what the Ottomans were thinking. France trying not to join a fight against the British, impossible. The French involvement in the independence cost so much money it eventually led to the French Revolution. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth also sent weapons. It was the last breath of the empire, because they were about to not exist anymore. Without the French, America would not have achieved independence, is what I'm hearing. I mean, yeah, pretty much. Why does the UK own Gibraltar? There's a spicy topic here. Obviously, still to this day, this is often talked about between the UK and Spain.
Despite it being a tiny stretch of land attached to Spain. The British took control of Gibraltar during the War of Spanish Succession, and they took it from Spain to keep the entrance of the mouth
the entrance of the mouth of the Mediterranean right there.
During the war. Spain ceded it to Britain in 1713 to get them out of the war, but they continued to claim it afterwards, and there were numerous sieges and attempts made by the Spanish.
They really wanted that rock.
All of which failed due to the strength of the British Navy. After Spain won the Revolutionary War, they were just happy to get Florida back and made no attempt to get it in the peace terms. During World War II, the Axis offered Spain Gibraltar if they joined.
Remember that, Spain stayed neutral in both world wars, which is still a fact that like gets to me a little bit. I'm like, dang, how did they, it's not so much how they did that, but it's just like, I want to say why, but I know why. I mean, they just weren't in a place to be fighting at that time.
Since they were still recovering from their civil war.
Yes, the Civil
War.
After
the war, Gibraltar consistently voted to remain British, and there were no more military attempts by Spain to retake it.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably going to continue to be a very hotly contested topic for the next, I don't know, the next century, up until the next century. I mean, maybe eventually it'll go back to Spain, but I don't know at this point. The British did just give back the Chagos Islands, so maybe it's possible the British just don't want it one day anymore. Fun fact, by this point, Britain has owned Gibraltar longer than Spain did. Yeah, remember, Spain didn't exist forever. It only formed as a nation after the Iberian wedding in 1492. Maybe before that, 1479, but this was the date where they kicked out Muslims from Iberia. Gibraltar looks like tiny Florida. Because we like collecting rocks, admittedly, it got out of hand with the whole largest ever empire thing, but we scaled it back. It's part of the National Rock Collection. The audacity of Spain to demand the return of Gibraltar when right over the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar is, what could that be? Yeah, they still to this day control a lot of territories over across the Mediterranean in modern day Morocco. Literally, it's like a bunch of mini Gibraltars just in Morocco. Why didn't the USSR annex Finland? Remember that Finland was already a part of the Russian Empire before it became the USSR, and then there was the Winter War during World War II. You would think the Soviets would have wanted taken that territory back.
Despite them attacking the Soviets,
I'm curious what this video is going to say.
War. Annexing Finland would cost a lot of manpower and money, and they were more needed at the time against Germany than Finland, especially considering the Soviets' past humiliation during the Winter War and the huge human cost of it all. Finland could also be used in international relations to support the USSR in world affairs and give their actions more legitimacy. The Russians also feared Sweden would join NATO since the USSR would have shared a border with them, and they wanted to limit the expansion of NATO in Europe.
That makes sense. Back in those days, obviously, the Soviets have been trying to limit expansion of NATO for a very long time, as you can see, and they're still trying to do that, and it's kind of backfiring.
Decided not to annex Finland. Finally, the USSR guaranteed Finnish independence and neutrality in a friendship treaty in 1948.
It was probably a smart diplomatic move in hindsight. Even though there's historical claims for the Russians to have annexed Finland, like, it's best just to leave them alone. Which is surprising because they didn't leave a whole lot of other countries alone, TBH. But for some reason, Finland, the USSR was like, you guys are good. Obviously, just recently, both Finland and Sweden decided to finally join NATO, so all of that, yeah, it didn't really work out, I guess, in the end. So, yeah. How did Sweden stay out of World War II?
Despite all of its neighbors being involved. The main reason was...
and World War I, if you think about it. Kind of funny to think about so many S nations that remained neutral during the World Wars. Spain, Switzerland, Sweden. All three of them didn't get involved. This one should be controversial because...
The main reason was that Sweden exported a huge amount of iron to Germany, which you needed to build things like tanks, ammo, and other war materials.
And then they let Germany use the railroads.
Germany never invaded and took the iron forcefully because the Allies would have likely bombed the iron fields and limited iron production. Sweden also made sure to help out both sides by allowing millions of German troops through their territory to invade the USSR and giving intelligence to the Allies.
It's a tough one.
Finally, Sweden spent the last 150 years remaining neutral, and so they really had no reason to join if they didn't have to.
I feel like we could have gone a little bit more in depth here, but I mean, what was Sweden really gonna do? They remained alone in the European continent. They literally saw their biggest rival ever, Denmark, get capitulated in 6 hours. That's like if Mike Tyson came up to your best friend and just knocked him straight out, like instantly, boom. You gonna fight Mike Tyson? Like, I'm not. I'm probably gonna be like... I'll just give you the cash in my wallet right now. Just leave me alone, please. Hilter farted at 3 p.m. yesterday. Swedish intelligence. Two types of neutral. Play neither side, says Switzerland. Sweden says play both sides. Fun fact, Lund, a Swedish town, was accidentally bombed by the British, which led to the demise of 6 chickens and a destroyed greenhouse. No! Very nice history now. Like those videos. Please go subscribe. As always, big thanks to my patrons. Month 2. In Drew's basement. Drew's Argentinian Grandpa. I'm back, boys. I can't sleep. Kansas was mentioned. Amateur Archaeology. aPhatNarwhal. Carmel Fredrik Tibblin. KingBearHaze. KirinoIsBestGirl. Mgmluthegoat. Tyrol. Tambre. Mexican 760. If you like your name here, check that link to Patreon down below.